Dave Monroe here again, and with this video we'll finish our study of Act Utilitarianism. We will talk a little bit about how to apply this theory to help you make everyday ethical decisions. It's very important before we start that you are familiar with the case study about Carina's dilemma from the chapter on consequentialist ethical theories. Throughout these videos, we'll be using that as our example, so unless you're familiar with that, this won't make much sense. If you haven't had a chance to study that case study and read it over, it'll take you about 5 minutes. You should do that before you come back and watch this video. That way you understand what's going on. So, when we apply Act Utilitarianism to a problem, there is a 5-step process that we use to do so. All of this is contingent on that utility principle that we've talked about in other videos, and you'll see that in action as we go through this particular case. The first step is to identify the ethical decision that has to be made. The second step, think about the possible options for solving the problem or possible actions that you might make. Third, consider the people affected by those optional actions. Fourth, determine the net utility of each option, and here's where the greatest happiness principle or utility principle comes into play, where you're weighing out the expected pleasures and pains. And fifth, choose and follow the option that produces the highest net utility. So which of these options is the one that makes the most people happy? In our case with Carina's dilemma, when we identify the ethical decision to be made, the question is essentially, what should Carina do with this information that she's learned about the illegal dumping of chemicals by her company? That much we've got figured out, fairly straightforward. The next step, let's think about what possible optional actions there are for Carina as she solves this particular problem. First, she could keep quiet and do her job. She may say nothing. She may think, well, you know what, it's not really my place to say anything about this. That's one thing I could do, is just do nothing at all. The second thing Carina could do is quit her job and try to find another one. If she doesn't like the way that this company does business, then perhaps she leaves and goes and finds another place where she's more comfortable working, but doesn't do anything about the illegal chemical dumping. In the third option, Carina could blow the whistle on the company via her reporter uncle. As you guys will recall from the story, Carina has an uncle that works locally as a reporter. So what she could do is take the information about the illegal dumping to her uncle, the reporter. Or, lastly, in the options that we've thought through here, Carina could give the company managers an ultimatum to stop dumping or else she'll report it. So that is to say, she could give them the option to fix the problem themselves before she goes to an outside source. Now, it's worth noting that these aren't all the ways that Carina could solve this problem. There are several more we could come up with, but for sake of brevity, these are the 4 that we'll look at. But when you're solving a real-life problem, remember that the more options you come up with, the more likely you are to find a good decision. The third step of applying Act Utilitarianism is to consider all the people who are affected by these optional responses. So, to whom does this matter? In other words, who are the stakeholders, as you guys will recall from our critical thinking model? Who's going to be affected by the outcomes here? Well, the first and most obvious person is Carina herself. She's got the ethical decision to make, so in some sense, she's one of the primary stakeholders, maybe more to gain or lose than almost anyone else here. As you recall from the case, Carina also has 2 children, so her children are affected by the decision that Carina makes. Thirdly, Carina's coworkers, the other folks who work with her at the chemical company. Fourth, the company managers. They're the ones who've been sanctioning this illegal dumping for however long it's been going on, so it certainly matters to them how this decision is made. And the local citizens, as you'll recall, Carina believes that the toxic waste is being dumped near the local reservoir, which seems to have ramifications for all of the citizens who live in the local area. And then lastly, the reporter uncle has a stake in this particular case if Carina goes forward to him with the information. So these are the folks who'd be affected. Again, like with the options, if we were really thinking hard about this and digging deeper, we could come up with quite a few more people than this to add to our list. But for sake of our example, we'll stay with these 6 people or groups. Now here's where things get pretty tricky and a little bit more difficult to understand. We need to determine the net utility of each option. So as you'll recall from our discussion of the utility principle, the net utility is the sum total of happiness balanced against unhappiness that an action produces. So we take the amount of happiness it would produce and subtract from that the amount of unhappiness it would produce, with the idea being we promote as much happiness as we possibly can. So actions with high net utility are better than actions with low net utility. Now the tricky part here about trying to determine the net utility of each option is, like we mentioned in a previous video, it's difficult to say exactly how happy or unhappy someone would be with the outcome of an action. So your best you can do here is to ballpark with reasonable expectations about whether folks are likely to be happy or not, and then assign to them what we call happiness units. And that would be a number on a scale between, let's say, 1 and 10. Negative 10 and 10, where negative 10 would be a kind of maximally unhappy, and 10 would be a maximally happy, and assign them a number somewhere on that continuum to represent roughly what you think or how you think how happy a person might be given that option. So I've filled in this chart for you guys. We've got the options along the top. We've got the stakeholders, or the people affected, along the side. And in the boxes, you'll notice the values assigned on that continuum, the net utility. At the bottom, you'll see the sum of the net utility for each of the options. So as I figured it, keeping quiet, if Karina were to say nothing, yields a net utility of negative 31. It looks like everyone in this situation is unhappy if that's the option that Karina chooses. Quitting her job also seems to lead to a negative net utility. For many of the same reasons, if you thought deeply about it. Quitting her job doesn't really address the problem, and if people are unhappy with her keeping quiet, they'd be just as likely to be unhappy if she quits her job and does nothing. On the other hand, you'll notice that whistleblowing and delivering an ultimatum to the bosses yield positive net utilities. So intuitively, at least, these seem like more promising options. But there's one other factor that we have to take into consideration. Remember that it's the happiness or unhappiness of every individual who has a stake that counts, and no one person's happiness counts more than another's. So Karina's happiness doesn't count any more than, say, Bob McX, the local citizen. We have to parse him out too and think about his individual happiness and unhappiness. So that means adding a level of complexity to our math here. We have to ballpark a little bit when it comes to this and maybe make some estimates about how many people might be affected by this, not knowing the exact population of the town and so forth and so on. I've done some assignment of values here. We know that there's at least one Karina, or only one Karina. We know that there are 2 children that Karina has. We'll estimate that maybe the number of coworkers is something like 250. The company manager is something like 20. The local citizens, let's say it's a small town, so about 5,000 people live in the area, and there's one reporter uncle. So to figure out the total net utility in this circumstance, what we must do is take the value that we assigned in the more simple table and then multiply it by the number of stakeholders in each of these categories to yield the total net utility of that particular option. So for example, keeping quiet was a negative 6 in our original chart for the local citizens, but if there are 5,000 of them, and it's reasonable to think they'd be affected similarly, we might say that there are negative 30,000 happiness units associated with keeping quiet once you take in every individual person's interests. So if you extrapolate that out throughout the model, the keeping quiet seems to have a net utility of negative 31,601. Quitting her job has a net utility of negative 31,599. Those are pretty close. But notice how much more happiness is now produced when you look at these 2 options compared to the other chart. Blowing the whistle yields a net utility of positive 13,833, where the ultimatum yields positive 15,258. We've arrived at the last step of the model. Choose and follow the option that produces the highest net utility. So given the math that we've done and our best reasonable estimates about the likely outcomes in terms of happiness and unhappiness for everyone involved in this circumstance, it looks like what Karina ought to do is give the company managers an ultimatum to stop dumping, or else she'll report it. That's a simple, rough and ready going through this model once. The more you practice it, the better it gets. Don't be worried if you're a mathophobic. It's not that much arithmetic to do. Just do your best at making reasonable projections about the likely happiness or unhappiness that options will cause. In the next video, we'll talk about rule utilitarianism and go from there.